Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Bill Miskakos, and along with Alicia Parnello, we are the co-curators of the online seminar series on doing queerness in the European South for the ALCS, Center for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing. As we are waiting for the people who have signed up to enter the room, I will briefly introduce the series and today's panel. So in this online seminar series, we will venture to explore queerness and its affordances for counter-hegemonic critique and resistance within the cultural framework of two countries of the European South, Italy and Greece. Today's panel is entitled The Colonise Antiquity, Archaeopolitics, Homosexuality. So the seminar series are articulated around a series of keywords. This seminar series is the product of long spells of intellectual and affective thinking and sharing and bonding with Alicia. When it comes to the rationale of today's panel, thinking and feeling together triggered a realization that we inhabit a common space of experiences in which the presence of antiquity, the ideological attachments and investments of the Greek and Italian nation states, and their queerness overlapped. That is, we encountered an antiquity already co-opted, curated, and mediated by nationhood to the point of, and with the intention of, obliterated queerness. Yet, an antiquity also affected by Western communities, discourses, representations, and practices to codify, legitimize, and in many ways, make the version of what we still actualize and embody as modern queerness emerge. Long story short, when the classical past enters the chat, we felt we cannot be, and simultaneously we could not help but be queer. So we started asking ourselves and each other, how do archaeologically informed politics of the nation state with salient gender components hold sway over lives? How do Eurocentric discourses of and on antiquity partake in the construction of modern homosexuality? How do intersectional, feminist, and queer countercultural practices attempt to decolonize and denationalize antiquity? In our effort to probe the analytical potential of these queries, we are grateful to Dimitris Plantzos, John Champagne, and Stefan Evangelista, who took up the challenge and responded so generously to our invitation. Dimitris' extensive work on the discipline of archaeology and the crafting of modern Greek identity, as well as his formulation of the concept of archaeopolitics, John's explorations of Italian masculinities through aesthetic modernism, fascism, and melodrama, and Stefanos' interrelations of British aestheticism, Hellenism, reception, and the visual have been inspirational and have crucially opened up new avenues for thinking, meaning, and researching. Before handing over to our first speaker, allow me a momentary digression to communicate that after reflecting on the shaping of this panel, we must acknowledge that it is a session mainly centered on male homosexuality. To be sure, this is not to erase or downplay the spectrum of queer identities and experiences relating to antiquity, and we would like to invite and encourage questions, comments, and interventions coming from other perspectives to be voiced during the discussion. Feel free to open your camera and participate, or as the session is being recorded, you may also type your questions and statements in the chat, and we will read them out for you. Our first speaker is Dimitris Plantzos, whose presentation is titled "We Have Never Been Queer: Ancient Sexualities and Present Archaeosocialities as a Way Not to Define the Modern Greek Self." Dimitris is professor of classical archaeology at the National Kapodistrian University of Athens. He studied history and archaeology at Athens and holds an MPhil and a DPhil in classical archaeology from Oxford, where he also spent 3 years as a British Academy postdoctoral fellow. He is the author of various papers and books on Greek art and archaeology, archaeological theory, and classical reception. His books on Greek art and archaeology, and more recently, The Art of Painting in Greek and Ancient Greece, are available in Greek and in English by local press. He's currently finishing a monograph titled L'Archaeopolitique, Antiquité, Territoire, Population, scheduled to appear in 2025 by Sorbonne University Press. Since 2022, he's director of the Research Center for the Digital Humanities based at the University of Athens. Dimitri, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Billy and Alice, for your invitation. Let me just share my screen before I start my paper. Hopefully it's okay now, is visible. Okay, so the much advertised broadcast last January of a new Netflix docudrama exploring, as well as exploiting, it would seem, the life and times of Alexander III of Macedon, popularly known as Alexander the Great, triggered in Greece a wave of moral panic and cultural frustration of the sort by now well familiar to those of us studying modern Greece. The much recognizable as well as volatile mixture of identity, gender, and ethno-nationalist politics that has come to dominate public discussion in the country since at least the 1990s. This is the Minister for Culture of Greece explaining in the parliament itself why the series is at fault. Boldly titled Alexander, the Making of a God, the series, spanning over 6 roughly 1 hour long episodes, was touted by Netflix as an homage to the conqueror who built one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen and changed the course of history. This is from the blurb of the series. As a docudrama, the series combined dramatized reenactments of supposedly actual events performed by actors and actresses, fully costumed and made up, with apparently authentic interviews with established scholars who introduced the viewer to an academic viewpoint regarding the same events. As a hybrid of documentary and drama, however, and a fact-based representation of real events, Alexander managed to enrage or at least alienate most factions in Greek society, and certainly the historians and the classicists who found the dramatic license the makers of the series allowed themselves and the gaps in the historical record way too upsetting for their academic sensibilities. And, on the other hand, the far larger group of the nationalists and archaeolators who became enraged with most of what the series had to offer, though mostly with Alexander's portrayal as a sentimentally unstable, often weak leader and a promiscuous lover engaging in homosexual acts with his buddy Hephaestion, with whom he seemingly shared his entire life as husband and husband. And this despite the fact that Alexander is seen in the series also conducting heterosexual liaisons, as well as some of which appear equally fictionalized. This is certainly not the place here to discuss Alexander's sexual biography, nor Greek homosexuality for that matter. In today's terms, Alexander could and would be described, perhaps he would self-identify even as bisexual, as well as an alcoholic and other such character-altering vices like substance abuse. But this is not the point. Back then, he and Hephaestion, endearingly emulating the mythological archetypes of Achilles and Patroclus, did nothing most other young Macedonians would not do. If they were criticized for it, it would be most likely because of the way Alexander and Hephaestion handled their menage in relation to business of the state, which they did not always manage to keep separate. The Netflix series, on the other hand, seems to have studied the nature of Alexander's life partnership with Hephaestion quite closely. In the first episode, after all, we do have the by now notorious encounter of the two boys by a river somewhere in Illyria, emphasizing correctly that Alex was both younger and shorter than his mate, thus alluding, for some of us in the know, that at least in the beginning, Alex was Hephaestion's twink. Be that as it may, the scene and the series at large triggered a violent wave of discontent in Greece, mostly though not exclusively, played out over the social media. Even the Greek Ministry of Culture, as I just said, had to issue a statement, and the minister herself appeared in the parliament to condemn the series for its alleged inaccuracies. Many of the comments in the social media and the press recycled the familiarly homophobic comments about the impossibility of such a great leader being a homosexual and how homosexuality never existed in Greece in the first place. Discussions were held in almost every media outlet, and even myself had the privilege of appearing in a couple of shows, including Natalia Germanou Sunday magazine, Καλύτερα δεν γίνεται, As Good as It Gets, which where I was asked to comment on Alexander's sexual relations, among other things. And just by looking at this picture in front of me, I'm thinking that perhaps this is as queer as Greek TV can get on a Sunday afternoon. Of course, my task now, today, is not to discuss ancient Greek homosexuality, nor to dish the dirt on Alex and his chappies, rather to explore why a show like Netflix's Alexander would tickle Greek reflexes on how classical Greece should be embraced in modernity. We all know that modern Greeks habitually style themselves as the legitimate offspring of the glory that was Hellas. A certain archaeolatric ethos has been permeating Greek society and public discourses about the past since at least the establishment of the Greek state back in the 1830s. In recent years, however, and following the repeated social, economic, and political challenges Greek society has been facing, such archaeolatric notions have been turned into something of an archaeopolitical regime. And this, that is, a realm where antiquity becomes an instrument for politics and a yardstick for public control, manipulation, and sorting. These projections of the past invariably focus on appropriately patriarchal readings of ancient Greek society, engendered and embodied in ways modern ethno-nationalist, exceptionalist, and racist ideologies would approve. These readings are inevitably hostile to queer readings of the past, even if these seem to make actual historical sense. In my recent work, I have defined such organized institutional archaeolatry as archaeopolitics. That is, a public discourse that is both political and archaeological, in that it feeds off a collective desire for the materialities of the past in order to usher a new sort of political technologies into the present. Archaeopolitics, therefore, is an acculturated form of biopolitics, assimilated into discourses of the past rather than the present or the future. In archaeopolitics, I argue, control over life is disguised as a noble kind of love of things ancient, an archaeophilia, so to speak, an aspiration to a higher life model that is not imposed to anyone, but ought to be inherently felt by everyone. As a result, whereas biopolitics strives to organize entire populations according to a newly set disciplinary and regulatory economy, archaeopolitics mobilizes excuse me, archaeophile sentiments in order to manage life in the present. Like biopolitics, moreover, archaeopolitics affects, informs, and enables modern technologies of governmentality, an archaeomentality, if you will. Alexander in his sexual biography has long now been implemented in the ways modern Greek archaeomentality becomes enforced. Oliver Stone's biopic Alexander, filmed in 2004, 20 years ago, was, what we all remember, greeted in Greece with hostility, mostly because of the extended coverage it afforded of the king's love liaison with the Persian eunuch Bagoas, well attested in historical sources, and of course Hephaestion. while an academic conference in Thessaloniki in the 1990s was violently interrupted by protesters who were enraged by some of the participants' comments regarding Alexander's and Philip's homosexuality. Philip was Alexander's father, Philip II. As I have argued before, modern Greeks favor a seemingly benign, sexless, and dequeered version of Greek homosexuality and sexuality at large, whereby any reference to same-sex love or even sexual relations are ferociously edited out. Adonis Georgiadis, for one, a high-flying Greek right-wing politician and currently Greek Minister of Health, had published just 2 years before Oliver Stone's Alexander his best-selling essay titled Homosexuality in Ancient Greece, The Myth Collapses, where he endeavors to debunk the myth, as he calls it, of Greek homosexuality, based on what he advertised to be a close and accurate reading of the ancient Greek texts themselves, which he, of course, grossly misread, even though he is a historian. He has a degree from my department, actually. He studied history and archaeology at Athens. Georgiadis' intentions are well laid out in the book's blurb, and let me quote from there in translation. The aim of this research, he says, is not to position ourselves positively or negatively on the phenomenon of homosexuality per se, but to ascertain the views of the ancient Greeks themselves on the issue. It should be noted, he continues, that the opinion is being artificially spread that the ancient Greeks were much more tolerant of this habit, he puts it in inverted commas, than we are, and that homosexuality was not only an accepted practice, but also almost mandatory for every educated Greek of that time. In any case, he continues, this effort is neither innocent nor accidental. In the context of the new age we live in, he posits, almost everything is trivialized. So some, wanting to use the glory and prestige of our ancient classical culture to strengthen their views, allow such an image to be cultivated. That's the end of the quote from the blurb of this book, Homophilophilia στην αρχαία Ελλάδα, Homosexuality in Ancient Greece. So, an unseen enemy threatening the integrity of our, meaning Greek, modern Greek culture is lurking out there, positioned and triggered by New Age. Such limited and grossly misleading readings of ancient texts, images, and practices have been flourishing in Greece in recent years, ready to resurface whenever opportunity rises. Historian and writer Erkos Apostolidis was widely quoted recently as saying regarding the Netflix documentary on Alexander that it would be impossible for, and I'm quoting again, for a man who does not know what he's doing, the executive γίνεται, drunk and effeminate, meaning Alexander as portrayed in the series, to manage to reach India, να καταφέρει να φτάσει στην Ινδία. I must say that the same arguments were thrown back at me in the comment section of a YouTube interview, the very popular channel, The Mythologist, last February, when I briefly commented on Alexander's life and his portrayal in films. Although the reception of that show, now having exceeded 120,000 views, was mostly positive, we did seem to get this persistent backlash from particular listeners who would not accept any hint of homosexual liaisons as quite normalized in ancient Greece, but in return would accuse us, myself and my interviewer, of pushing a wokeist LGBTQ agenda. I am convinced, and have argued so in writing for many years, that Modern Greek receptions of Greece and Greek sexuality are fundamentally homosocial, that is, promoting an image for classical Greece based on same-sex relationships that are not of a romantic or sexual nature, such as friendship, mostly between men, of course, or mentorship of younger men by older men, and so on. Even the well-known and easily defined terms for erastes, which means male lover, and eromenos, meaning lover boy or beloved boy, are now taken by the likes of Georgiadis, Apostolidis, and the rest to refer to an assumed higher notion of love, sexless and passionless, spared from the vulgar and debasing toils of the flesh. Think of how Apostolidis, in the passage as just quoted, equated homosexuality with effeminacy, and thus, by his heteronormative logic, also feebleness, inability to be a ruler of men, and cowardice. Fascinated by the oddly archaeopolitical rituals of the West's higher modernity, with the likes of Isadora Duncan and her brother, Eva Palmer Sikelianos and her troops, turned the love of things Greek into a morbid affectation for the educated upper middle classes, deploying their classicalized bodies into a make-believe scenery of homosocial aestheticism. Present-day Greek revivalists appropriate the Greeks into a strictly no homo archaeosocial condition, consisting of a vast repertoire of thoroughly improvised official, and here's an image from the Olympic flame ritual as staged at Olympia back in 2012, and a recent ceremony like this one was held just a few weeks ago, so from official like this one to semi-official or entirely unofficial and improvised ritualistic performances, effectively recycling classical Greek patriarchy and the supposed ideal of white supremacy into modern Greek narratives of ethno-nationalism, sexism, and flat-out racism. This is particularly evident with several political and fringe political parties and factions in Greece promoting far-right, fascist, and neo-Nazi agendas, such as the notorious Golden Dawn, whose ideas seem to have permeated most other sections of the current political spectrum. Here, images from Golden Dawn rituals at Thermopylae from the previous decade, but the same rituals, similar rituals were actually staged as late as last September at the anniversary of the battle at Thermopylae. They happen every year. Appropriating Greece's classical heritage helps naturalize racism and sexism as cultural staples of the glory that was Greece, as well as rehabilitate fascist thanatopolitics as a bona fide Greek practice and ideological standard. In this game of archaeopolitics, outmoded or even bluntly misplaced philologies of accuracy play a vital role, a role that is not altogether blameless. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to come back with the question and answer time.
Thank you so much, Dimitri, for this deployment of archaeopolitics as biopolitics and thanatopolitics. We will circle back to that in the discussion. Moving forward, let us welcome John Champagne. John Champagne is a professor of English at the Pennsylvania State University. He's the author of scholarly monographs and essays, novels, personal essays, and poems. His most recent book being Queer Ventennio, Italian Fascism, Homoerotic Art, and the Non-Modern in the Modern, published by Peter Lang in 2019. Champagne's work has appeared in such venues as Forum Italicum, Modern Italy, College English, and College Literature. His essay entitled Baron Corbert's Venice Letters and Modern Male Homosexuality is forthcoming in the Journal of the History of Sexuality. Champagne divides his time between Erie and his second home in Perugia. John will be speaking today on the Italian vice, rethinking the role of Italy in the invention of modern male homosexuality. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to Alice and Billy for organizing our talks today. My current research returns to the history of modern male homosexuality with the goal of reviving the memory of its racialized Mediterranean working class roots. I pursue this goal via an exploration of Northern European and US male same-sex tourism to Italy between the late 19th century and 1935-36 or so, when the fascists ramped up their persecution of what they called pederasts. At the same time, foreign tourists felt increasingly unwelcome, and tourism was negatively affected by Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. Sex tourism is a complex phenomenon that can include instances in which men specifically traveled to Italy for the express purpose of having sex with locals, or simply took advantage of experiences when they presented themselves. Some encounters were one-time exchanges of sex for money. In other cases, Northerners supplied their Italian lovers with gifts and money over an extended period of time, even after their lovers had married. As a result, it is not easy to characterize the relationships between gentlemen travelers and the Italians they loved. Thanks to several well-publicized scandals, by at least 1902, some literate Italians were aware that Italy had a homosexual sex tourism industry. Because from its beginnings in the criminal anthropology of Cesare Lombroso, Italian sexology differentiated between a congenital inversion and one acquired by vice, commentators understood these young workers as practicing a situational homosexuality for monetary gain. In imagining the contours of a historical materialist analysis of sex tourism, I have been much influenced by Christopher Chitty, who insists that we can only understand the modern relationship between sodomy and statecraft by adopting a longue durée. This means revisiting capitalism's origins in the city-states of late medieval Italy and the cross-class, transnational same-sex erotic relationships it fostered. Admittedly, this requires us to adopt the anti-Foucauldian position that prior to being named by either German sexology and its adherents or the literature of white bourgeois homosexuals such as Wilde, Gide, and Proust, queer life worlds already existed in the Mediterranean. Following Chitty, I use queer here to designate, quote, forms of love and intimacy with a precarious social status outside the institutions of family, property, and the couple form, unquote. Queer theory has long been dogged by its inability to understand modern homosexuality outside of two historical misconceptions, that it was invented either in the pages of elite medical journals or by privileged white bourgeois northern men of letters. Both of these dogmas ignore the evidence of, for example, working class, immigrant, and Black queer cultures that flourished in the New York City of the interwar years. They also fudge the way in which bourgeois white men were often required to travel to working class queer spaces in search of partners. Until homosexuality became what Chitty terms a category of bourgeois society, dominant queer life forms were working class. As for the other misconception, Chitty reminds us of sexology's truly limited audience. To assume, as Foucault does, that in one fell swoop, German sexology created an epistemological rupture between a pre-modern sexuality of acts and a modern sexuality of species is too facile. For scientific epistemologies of sexuality could not have achieved hegemony in late 19th and early 20th century Italy, for example, for it did not have the requisite disciplinary apparatus to make this possible. To offer a few schematic examples, in 1952, Carlo Levi was still lamenting the problem of illiteracy in the Italian South. Like prostitution, the job of keeping homosexuality out of public spaces fell to the police. An essay on the history of policing in Italy, however, suggests that at the end of the 19th century, police numbers were insufficient and the overall structure of the police apparatus was chaotic and archaic. Following World War I, the Italian police forces were on the verge of collapse. Concerning the Italian economy, before 1913, there was, quote, a large gap in real wages between Italy and the most developed European countries. Italian workers appear to have been quite poor, even when compared with less developed countries in other continents, unquote. It is hardly to be expected, then, that anyone other than bourgeois intellectuals and institutions would be influenced by the new scientific epistemology of sexuality. Both of these misconceptions concerning modern male homosexuality's history were fostered by queer theory's ambivalent relationship to queer history, as well as the role Eve Sedgwick's queer readings of canonical literature played in the field's formation. Queer theory's invention coincided with a time when many historians, Hayden White, Ferdinand Hodel of the Annales School, the Subaltern Studies Collective, feminists such as Joan Scott, were interrogating dominant approaches to historiography. And it took a few decades for queer theory to produce, for example, its own response to this critique that today is called queer unhistoricism. But by the same token, queer theory has since its inception been invested in a critique of liberalism and the universal subject of humanism, and could not avoid the nagging suspicion that when homosexuality became a category of bourgeois society, the homosexual subject was defined as white, male, and bourgeois. Reactivating the historical memory of working class, racialized queer cultures may challenge what critics of color have termed homonormativity, the condition whereby some non-normative sexual subjects not only benefit from capitalist inequity, but further it through projects of war and colonialism, neocolonialism. An unfortunate side effect, however, of attending to the racism in certain works of what has become the canon of early gay literature has been the non-dialectical proposition that there really were no modern homosexuals of color. In some queer critiques of racism, the first modern homosexuals were indeed late Victorian Edwardian white gentlemen. While scholarship exists on the seduction of the Mediterranean, to quote a noteworthy book title, that work tends to treat white bourgeois male visitors to the region as sexual subjects. As for the boys and young men with whom these visitors had sex, their sexuality is treated as pre-modern, residual, pre-capitalist, or primitive. Such studies are invariably organized around the many noteworthy artists who traveled to Italy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some of whom, like Carl Friedrich Ulrichs and J.A. Symonds, brought sexology with them. While we have a handful of names of their Italian lovers, Nino Cesarini, Angelo Fusato, Pancrazio Bucciuini, Emilio Papa, there has been relatively little exploration of their actual life conditions, aside from Mario Bolognari's excellent anthropological work. And when the life stories of these young men are explored, scholarship is not free from certain unexamined assumptions about their motivations and expressions of sexual desire, as if, for example, their contingent homosexuality was somehow a pseudo-homosexuality. Additionally, while many writers on the period note the degree to which Italians were racialized by their sexual partners, this analysis has typically been subsumed into a generalized Orientalism that threatens to replicate the very discourse employed by these white bourgeois gentlemen travelers themselves, whose writing is rife with references to the alleged Greek heritage of their lovers. As we will see, given the complexities of, for example, Sicily's history, its Greekness is always in tension with a knowledge of the many other peoples, for example, the Normans and the Muslims, who also inhabited the island. And Greek's history is itself sometimes understood as both Occidental and Oriental, especially by Northerners who wish to abandon themselves to pansexual Dionysian mysteries from the East, And I'm thinking here in particular of the orgiastic dream sequence in Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. One thing clearly at stake in my project is precisely what we mean by modern homosexuality. My own thinking has been strongly influenced by both queer unhistoricism's critique of linear teleological histories and Chitty's rejoinder to Foucault. Admittedly, one solution to the problem of the way Mediterranean homosexuality has been treated as pre-modern is simply to deny that there is anything specific to modern homosexuality whatsoever. This is in fact Giovanni Dall'Orto's position. But if following Chitty, we understand modernity as, quote, a non-teleological category when used to describe multiple overlapping life worlds, sexual norms, and self-understandings produced by an unevenly developing world system, unquote, we upend the history of modern sexuality we thought we knew. For Italy was not underdeveloped, but rather modern in a way that neither the UK, nor Germany, nor France, nor the US, for example, were. Overlapping life worlds found a home in Italian cities of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thanks to the unevenness of capitalist development. Sex tourism specifically juxtaposed indigenous queer Italian life worlds with the new sexual scientific epistemologies. Concerning the ubiquitous tendency of queer male visitors to Italy to understand their sexuality and that of their partners via a however ill-defined or historically erroneous Greek paradigm, Whitney Davis suggests that they were prepared to do so by then dominant canons of beauty. According to him, quote, in a sufficiently concentrated aesthetic of pederasty, a culture, strictly speaking, one could see what other men found to be beautiful in a youth without taking an erotic interest in it himself, unquote. This explains how pederastically determined imagery can and did achieve normative status. Beyond Winckelmann and German classicism, a broad neo-Hellenic revival was linked in France to the French Revolution and in England to both concerns around the future of the empire and the Oxford educational reform movement and its shift in the curriculum from Latin to Greek. As Bolognari has it, many Northerners traveled to Italy in search of Greece. This imagining of Italians as Greek was not limited to photographers such as Wilhelm van Gluden and Guglielmo Pluschow. In his 1887 guidebook, German diplomat and writer Karl Augustus Schniegens notes in the faces of the people he passes in the streets of Taormina something foreign, quote, big and swollen lips, nose flattened like that of a Kalmyk, low forehead, olive-skinned, black and kinky hair. The race is an Asian and African jumble, and one could call them white Negroes, unquote. He then adds, however, that, quote, among this people, one now and then finds finer features resembling the Italian or Greek type. They could be compared to the Greco-Roman remains which arise in the midst of the Saracen constructions, unquote. A similar longing for Greece is demonstrated over a half century later in 1954 by Richard Aldington, who laments of Calabria, quote, earthquakes and wars, harryings of Saracens and Turks, religious fanatics, deforestation, tyrants, brigands have made almost total destruction of all that men created here and have obliterated or basely degraded their descendants. What remains of the brilliant city-states of Magna Grecia? The implication here is that Italians are partly to blame for spoiling their Greek heritage. Douglas Sladen, author of one of the first English guidebooks on Sicily, wrote in 1905 of Sicilian boys as beautiful as Greek statues. In Edward Prime Stevenson's 1913 short story, Out of the Sun, the protagonist describes his Italian lover as filled with an Italic Hellenic grace. In a travel diary, Italian bookseller Giuseppe Orioli quips that a 14-year-old boy is learning to be Alcibiade. Franz Schönberner makes an explicit connection between the social function pederasty played in antiquity and its alleged reincarnation in a more prosaic form in Taormina. First, differentiating a neurotic modern homosexuality characterized by an exclusive attachment to a same-sex object from the ancient Greek male's ability to find, quote, the ambiguous charm of a not fully developed boy, unquote, as attractive as feminine beauty, the writer then makes a direct connection between ancient Greek pederasty and then current same-sex practices. According to Schönberner, quote, for the Greek boy, it was a disgrace if he was not attractive enough to be chosen by a riper man who was to become his guide, his teacher, his protective friend, and lover. On a more matter-of-fact basis, a similar situation still existed in Taormina for the Sicilian fisher boys. Their normal career, sanctioned by a long tradition, was to live for some years with a more or less wealthy foreigner in his villa until at 19 or 20 they decided to marry, unquote. Yet after having established in ancient Greece a historical precedent for the tendency of Sicilian boys to take older foreign men as their lovers, the author then contradictorily attributes such boys' good looks to, quote, all the different races and peoples who in the course of the centuries have passed over this island, Greeks and Romans, Normans and Arabs, and slightly Negroid Africans, not to forget Germans and Anglo-Saxons, unquote. Why none of the non-Greek peoples in this list are cited as the origin of pederastic same-sex relationships is left unsaid. All of this suggests the degree to which Northern European and American tourists seemed unable to understand the Italian forms of queer life they witnessed as anything other than a residue of ancient Greece. This misreading of indigenous Italian forms of homosexuality as pre-modern was actually assisted by an emerging model of homosexuality as an exclusive attachment to the same sex of men of equal status, since Orientalists and sexologists well knew that this new model had little to do with antiquity. As Simmons worried about the age difference in classical male homoerotic relationships, quote, we cannot be Greek now, unquote. Of course, schooled Italians were aware of Italy's Greco-Roman past and its tolerance of male-male erotic relationships. Given their investments in concepts such as atavism and degeneration, Italian sexological works, for example, regularly include a historical survey of homosexuality that references Greece and Rome. Even Lombroso proposed that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. This too furthered a tendency, even in Italy, to link contemporary Italian same-sex behaviors to the ancients. Beyond this ubiquitous neo-Hellenism, why a queer sex industry in Italy? By the mid-1800s, tourism was increasingly available to the middle classes. Railways connected more and more Italian cities. Venice was revitalized as a port from which the British departed for the East. Unlike Germany and Great Britain, Italy had no anti-sodomy legislation and no police force as well developed as France. Chitty specifically relates the state persecution of homosexuality to the entry of bourgeois women into public spaces and the purity campaigns against first prostitution and then public indecency that followed. In Italy, this occurred later than in, say, the rest of Europe, especially in the Italian South. Why the attraction to working class boys? Queer critics of color in particular have written about the association of non-white sexualities with the primitive and exotic. And thanks to what Ray Chow has called categorical miscegenation, working class sexualities are themselves often racialized. This helps us to understand why these Italian sex workers were typically understood as inhabiting a racial category other than white. Even Venetian boys are characterized by Friedrich Rolf, alias Baron Corvo, as Oriental. But the sexual appeal of the alleged racial difference of these working class Italian boys is only half the story. For this is also the time when, according to Marxist theorist Kevin Floyd, desire is being reified. Increased industrialization and the expansion of a professional managerial class fraction torn between the interests of workers and owners contribute to the invention of the idea of gender, which paradoxically hypostasizes genital difference in order to insist that masculinity and femininity name qualities that can be split off from something called biological sex one is assigned at birth. That the concept of gender historically relied, I'm sorry, that's my timer, so I'll just finish my sentence. That the concept of gender historically relied on some alleged originary biological binary difference it defines itself against demonstrates Freud's argument that the reification of desire is accompanied by the freeing up of gender from a necessary relationship to genitals. And if you'd like, during the question and answer period, I can talk more about what Freud means by the reification of desire and how the invention of gender assists capitalism in its division of labor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for this upending of Foucault and of queer history as we know it. This is a really productive challenge, and I can't wait to hear more on that